Hello, I'm Jan Wasitsky and I'm here with historian Marjorie Theobald. Marjorie Theobald lives in Castlemaine, where we are at the moment, but she began her working life as a secondary school teacher, during which time she did her masters. And it was a history of women's education in Australia in the 19th century. And a book came out of it titled The Origins of Women's Education in Australia. From there, Marjorie went to working as a historian at Melbourne University from 1987 to 2001, but then she retired to write history, and she's currently writing a history of the first 10 years of Castlemaine, where, as I said, we are now. So Marjorie, thanks very much for having us into your home. And can you tell us what your connection is with the history of the gold rush here and this place?
Well, we're sitting here in this house in Castlemaine, and I've actually come full circle. I'd love to be able to say I was born here, but I was actually born in Ballarat, where we were briefly living when my father was sluicing for gold at Smythesdale. I was back here before I remember it, and then I was brought up here. And six branches of my family were here in the 1850s, and all but one of them was connected with gold. When I was a child, I still had my father's uncles who talked about nothing else but gold, as if indeed the rush had never ended.
Did he use that term, nothing else but gold?
No. But it was Sunday afternoon conversation. If you went to visit them, they were still talking about gold.
What sort of a place was Victoria before the gold rush?
Well, I now understand it in very different terms from when I was doing history at school.
Yeah.
I now am shocked, really, I suppose, to find that early Melbourne was really the headquarters for clearing the Aboriginal people off their land. It was a very harsh place, very unforgiving place.
Yes.
And therefore it doesn't amuse me. I become slightly angry when I see the old guard, if you like, accusing the miners of wrecking a perfectly wonderful society, because it wasn't that way at all. So I think if you're teaching children about pre-gold Melbourne and Victoria now, you have to introduce those very unpleasant things that were happening.
Broadly speaking, in that regard, Melbourne was established beginning in June, in 1835, in July. August the 30th was supposedly the founding day, to make it exact. By the time of the gold rush in 1851, what, broadly speaking, had happened to the Aboriginal people over Victoria?
The Aboriginal people had been dispossessed, and those that were left were living in thoroughly miserable conditions on the outskirts of Melbourne, or many of them were, or in reserves. And that's something we weren't told when we were learning history at school many years ago.
And the land was occupied by whom?
The land was occupied almost entirely in Victoria by this time by what we call squatters. The term later was taken up by them so that it was had prestige to be a squatter. All they had, in fact, was a £10 lease, which they had to pay yearly, which gave them a right to run sheep, but not even on a particular tract of land. But they, by 1851, by the time of the gold rushes, they'd developed a psychology of ownership. Some of them had built substantial homes. They'd fenced in half a mile around the homestead, this kind of thing, and believed really that they were entitled to that land, and were very surprised to find that when the miners arrived on their land, as long as the miners paid their monthly licence, they had as much right as a squatter to be there.
So the squatter that was local to Castlemaine, after whom the main street up the middle is named, Dr. William Barker, he had 30,000 acres.
Well, he didn't have anything.
Okay. All right.
He
He
did-
had. He
Well,
was running his sheep on 30,000
yes,
acres.
which he believed to be his run called the Mount Alexander Run, and the other one was William Campbell on Strathloddon, and those two together covered most of the gold fields. They had, in fact, I don't know if you want this much detail or not, Jan.
Go on.
In 1847, they'd won, an order in council was passed back in Westminster, which was going to set up leases for them, with the right to buy a 640 block round their homestead. Now, what happened was, even before the gold rushes, there were problems with surveying the runs. There were problems with disputes between boundaries and so forth. There were problems, in inverted commas, with the Aboriginal people, many of whom refused to go away. So when the gold rushes occurred from mid-1851 onwards, the squatters were push to have these leases signed as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. And La Trobe, to his credit, wasn't all that keen about doing so. He did in 1848 call for what I suppose you might call tenders for the leases, and you can actually find in the Victorian Government Gazette page after page after page of these applications for leases. And the descriptions of the boundaries are really quite funny. It's, well, my boundary's next to Joe Blow's, and then you turn left at the burnt stump and go down the river and this, that and the other.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, they're quite sensible, easy directions
but they
to follow.
certainly did not own them
Right.
at that time.
Did they know there was gold on their properties around here?
William Campbell and his mate Donald Cameron knew, and Dr. Barker's employees had found some gold and showed it to him earlier on, but it was four of his employees, who were hut keepers and various other things, who made the first real discoveries here. This is Worley and Peters and Co. that you would have heard of.
Yes.
Out in Specimen Gully, Barker's Creek.
Yes.
They left his employ and started mining there. And he found them and said he'd have them charged with trespass, etc., etc. And then, of course, the first regulation came in on the 16th of August 1851 that you had to buy a licence, etc., etc. So in the face of this bullying, they wrote a letter to the Argus. The Argus becomes very important in the history of the goldfields, in which they gave their exact location and said they were doing quite well and they were prepared to pay any reasonable sum for a licence.
What did La Trobe do? What was his response to a gold rush? He had become the governor of a colony, and immediately there's a gold rush.
Yes. Victoria gained its independence from New South Wales in mid-1851, and La Trobe was in two minds about that, because he'd very much enjoyed playing second fiddle to the various governors up in New South Wales. He was something of a sort of cultured gentleman, you know. And suddenly there he was now governor, though he was still called Lieutenant Governor of Victoria. And Victoria had the right to have a legislative council, which was 30 members, 10 of them nominated by La Trobe and 20 elected, with a very fierce property qualification, so the squatters got hold of it, of course.
What sort of property qualification to be in the government?
They couldn't actually have used their... Yes, they could, that's right. The fact that they were paying the licence, I think, gave them the right to a vote, but then they didn't give the miners the right to a vote because they were paying the 30 shillings, of course. But what was I saying? Yes, La Trobe in his response. So he's faced with really getting the whole mechanism of a civil service and everything going, and the gold rushes occur at the same time. So he's not really the man for the job. I'm quite fond of Charles La Trobe, by the way.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the criticism is unfounded, but he wasn't perhaps the right man for the job.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on what sort of fellow he was?
He was highly cultured. He spoke several languages and was very well read. He had married a Swiss woman, and that caused a bit of flutter in early Melbourne, Sophie Latrobe. He wrote several books. He had travelled extensively in Europe and North and South America before he married.
Yes.
A very interesting man. But I think he was a little more comfortable with this second fiddle role than he was being in charge. So the first thing he did in August was to pass an edict through the Government Gazette, the 16th of August, saying, reminding everyone that the gold was owned by the Crown or Her Majesty, and that anyone mining for gold unlawfully would be prosecuted. And 2 days later or 3 days later, he gazetted the specific form of this, which was the 30 shillings a month licence fee. And that was to cause all the trouble, and it was not to be rescinded until after the Eureka tragedy.
And a rider on the same day's gazetted legislation, is it?
No, it wasn't legislation, it was just a gazetted notice, a regulation.
But if you wanted a licence, you had to provide proof that you had left your former employment with
Discharged.
Discharge, with their blessing,
Yes.
if they said you couldn't go.
That was under the Masters and Servants Act, which is we've got modern day equivalents of arbitration, between employer and employee. There was a Masters and Servants Act, which in my view was heavily weighted towards the master and not the servant. But you were supposed to, if you broke a contract, you were supposed to have proof that that was all right for you to go. Yes, that was one of the things that was actually printed on the licence even, I think. But with a huge avalanche of men who just rushed across central Victoria in those months, that just was completely impossible to enforce.
Yes. But what was his motive? Why? What was he trying to achieve by the gold licence?
Because you couldn't have people... about the gold licence.
The gold licence. So he imposes a 30 shillings a month gold licence. What's he on about? Why?
Well, he's perfectly right in that since Tudor times in England or Britain, nobody was allowed to mine for any sort of mineral wealth without the permission of the monarch, whether it was royalty, licence, whatever. That was quite well known in mining circles, and indeed in other countries in Europe. So no one should have been surprised. But then, on a practical level, people who sold their labour had to be kept under control, or the harvest wouldn't be brought in, the factories wouldn't be able to operate, nobody would have any servants, etc., etc. So it was a control thing as well.
How much of it was for revenue?
Oh, very much so for revenue too. Every governor who arrived in any of the colonies was given strict instructions before he left that he had to balance the budget above all else, so that the colonies were not any sort of charge on the mother country. They all came out with those instructions, so he knew he was going to have to pay for the administration that he was trying to set up to administer the goldfields.
So the Latrobe imposes the 30 shillings a month licence in the hopes of keeping everybody in their place in the world and also to raise a bit of money. So does it work?
Whether it worked is a curly one. My research, which is now quite extensive, leads me to believe that probably there was an evasion rate of 50% throughout that time.
Invasion rate?
Evasion.
Oh.
Evading
the
licence was probably running at about 50% most of the time.
And the gold licence, it didn't, they were 50%, you estimate, were evading.
I'm talking about right across the period. I would estimate 50% collection rate.
But neither did it work in terms of keeping people back where they ought to be.
Absolutely not. Total failure.
So we've got 25,000 or so, 20,000 diggers here on the Mount Alexander
Very
Forest
rubbery,
Creek Rush.
very rubbery figures, because how do you count them?
Yes.
And
And they're spread out.
they're spread out. You realise that by the time the monster meeting occurred, they were right down Friars Creek to the Loddon. They were down Campbell's Creek to what is now Yappeen, and they had reached Bendigo.
Well, the monster meeting happened on the 15th of December, 1851. There was other meetings before, one meeting a week before. What was it that caused the diggers to get together and meet?
It's quite straightforward. Their reason was that Governor La Trobe decided, as a one-man band, to double the licence fee to £3 a month. And that was gazetted in the Victorian Government Gazette, and the Argus immediately published it on the 5th of December. So that edition of the Argus would have been up here shortly thereafter, and within days a small group of leaders began to organise against it. They had the famous notice, which is read out every year at our own commemoration ceremony with the pusillanimous and the "Ye are Britons, will ye be oppressed," was produced within days of the Argus reproducing those new regulations.
Often a legal printing press.
Yes, La Trobe had refused someone, I don't know who it was, permission already to have a printing press on the diggings. So there was some kind of primitive printing press here. We know that between the two meetings they produced 1,000 handbills which were distributed, and they placed an advertisement in the Argus for the 12th of December to call the men to the really big meeting. But the first meeting on Monday the 8th of December was a very big meeting. It was between 3,000 and 4,000 men with just virtually word of mouth, plus a few dodges being handed out.
And it was held where?
We don't know. It was on Forest Creek. But given that the site of the meeting on the 15th was seen as the epicentre of mining at that time, it would have been close to there.
And what happened at the first meeting, and how many were there?
Well, once again, we've only got the Argus to make an estimate, and that's a reporter called R.J. Howard at the time. He estimated between 3,000 and 4,000 men turned up to that preliminary meeting. Well, that's a huge meeting.
Yes.
In itself. And then they showed no animosity. They appeared to show no animosity whatsoever to the small group of administrators who were there, Frederick Powlett and co. Indeed, they called on him to organise the second meeting, to chair the second meeting, to ask La Trobe to rescind this. Now, he said, well, actually, I have to be in Melbourne, he said. I don't know whether he was running scared or whether he'd already been summoned to Melbourne, I'm not sure, but he was not present at the monster meeting.
So at the first meeting, 4,000 meet. What do they say?
Well, we only have what the Argus said they said, so we only have what three leaders said, and they were our famous, now famous because we've made them famous,
Okay.
Lynham, Potts and Plaistow were the three who are mentioned at that meeting.
Yes.
And they said, this is terrible, we have to approach the governor to rescind this. We don't have as much of a report as we do of the second meeting.
Yes.
But it was still it was a wonderful piece of organisation under the most difficult of circumstances. I mean, we think we're wonderful because of Facebook being able to organise a revolution in Manila or something, but they did it here on the goldfields in a few days.
And we maybe should just quickly explain that a gold commissioner was appointed to be in charge of the administration of a certain goldfield. Well,
you have to feel sorry for La Trobe because he had to get throw up some kind of scaffolding of administration virtually overnight. So what he did was to take his land commissioners, who had been in charge or were still in charge of districts, and they were sort of sorting out fights between squatters and, unfortunately, also presiding over the dispersal of the native peoples. He took various men who'd been land commissioners and said, well, right, now you're a gold commissioner. And once again, the good old government gazette is pressed into service to... It's not just a matter of waving a magic wand, they've got to have the authority, so that would be gazetted, that they were now also... had the power to collect licences, I think was what it first said. Yeah. Now, Frederick Powlett, president of the Melbourne Club and close friend of La Trobe, happened to be the land commissioner for the area, and he was never, I believe he was never happy doing the job. He later condemned the licence system on the public record. But there he was. By October, he was putting up his little camp of tents, first of all, further up near Golden Point, and then he moved down to near where the monster meeting took place by the time of the monster meeting. We do have a sketch of it by the same man who sketched the monster meeting, Tulloch, David Tulloch.
Yes.
He was supported by various persons called assistant commissioners. Everyone had to be a gentleman, of course, to be in charge of anything. And they were the ones that caused a lot of the trouble, by and large, because they didn't know how to relate to men at all, ordinary men. And then as many foot and mounted police as could be got together. But the problem was the police were all leaving their jobs in Melbourne.
To go digging?
Yes. Inspector Evelyn Sturt, that's a man, Evelyn Sturt, in charge of police for Melbourne, said that he was all 48 of his 50 foot police in Melbourne had given in their resignations. So where do you get police? But somehow or other, I've checked, at the time of the meeting, the second meeting, the big meeting, there was Frederick Powlett, 6 assistant commissioners, or maybe 7, and 38 police of various kinds, including the native police who'd been rushed to the scene. Because there was no police force for Victoria at the time. There were only purpose-built police forces, one for Melbourne, one for Geelong, the native police, etc., etc.
And the diggers, talking to Powlett and asking him after their first meeting to
chair the meeting.
To chair the second meeting that they were going to have.
No ill feeling, no mention of police brutality. It was only the fact that the licence had been doubled by a man down in Melbourne, La Trobe. I don't think there'd been any real clashes over licences at this stage. Powlett knew that collecting them was absolutely hopeless, but I think it was still being seen as a kind of civil exchange between administrator and civilian at that stage. Your licence hunts come later.
Yes, so Powlett says, no, I'm going to Melbourne.
I have urgent business in Melbourne.
I've got business in Melbourne. And don't have the meeting here near my tent, have it somewhere else.
Go away, yes.
And so that's a week later.
They chose the Shepherd's Hut.
Shepherd's Hut, which was from Barker's Run.
Look, it could be the edge of Campbell's, we're not sure.
Okay.
Doug Ralph is inclined to think it's Campbell's.
Okay.
But you see, you're up against it because of this boundary business. You know, exactly where were the boundaries.
Yes.
It's one or the other. And
yes.
It could be the far edge of Campbell's. We're not sure. How
do they spread the word for what we now know? It's the second meeting, but we now know it as the monster meeting. How do they do the PR?
Oh, it's got to be word of mouth mainly, surely. Well, there's the handbills, and there's the advertisement in the Argus for the 12th, on the 12th. But mainly it'd be, because they're all riled up by now, you see, so it'd be word of mouth.
So the monster meeting's December the 15th, it's a Monday, late afternoon. What happened at the monster meeting?
Well, I suppose the first thing you have to say is that we really only know what the Argus told us. What happened was that they came from all over the diggings. There was a band called Hoare's Band, which led led the way down Forest Creek. I love the fact that there was already a band there
Yes.
so early.
A sax horn band.
Oh, I haven't heard that. I just
Particular
thought it was,
form of musical outfit that was becoming very popular in the United States at the time.
I see. Yes,
And in the Civil War, it became the band.
the band.
Yeah. So they were there, horse band.
Yes.
Yep.
There was a dray for the platform, and there was a chairman called, now, was it JM or JH? Man. Esquire, which means he was middle or upper class. I think I know who he was, but without my notes I can't remember.
Yep.
And there were designated speakers, 3 of whom were the ones who ran the earlier meeting. Now, the speakers ran off on all kinds of issues other than the licence, which is, I guess, the really interesting thing about it.
Yeah.
I would believe that the miners only attended because it was about the licence.
Yes.
And I believe they only supported the next 2 movements, because it was about the licence as well. But the men who called them together appear to have been men of some education and with some knowledge of previous social movements like Chartism in England and so forth. And they really made some quite inflammatory statements, and we have to understand that they did. Now, I can't remember without my notes who said what, but certainly at least 2 of them likened the situation to the loss of the American colonies, an unjust tax.
Well, I happen to have the transcript.
You just happen to have the transcripts, right?
Of what they said, and the first speaker, Potts, he said, the Home Government does not require, nor do they possess the power to enforce unjust taxation. It was such taxation that lost Great Britain America. Pause. I hope, brother diggers, as a Briton, such unjust taxation will not be the cause of separating these splendid colonies from the mother country.
Well, that was an extremely inflammatory comment.
Or is there a chance? So, is he not maybe even they're flying a kite? How serious is he?
Probably not at all serious, but you're La Trobe sitting down in Melbourne, waiting for the next copy of the Argus, and reading that, you become alarmed. You don't want to be the governor who loses the Australian colonies, do you?
Probably not.
Now, a second one mentioned that as well. I think it was Harrison, wasn't it?
Harrison,
Our famous Captain John Harrison.
Captain John Harrison also said, and if I've got the right place here, I think I have, he considered the tax unconstitutional.
Which is a different point, I suppose, yes.
And it was a similar tax that lost Charles I his head.
I've forgotten about that, yes.
And it's unjust taxation that caused the United States to throw off the burthen, and unless the government learnt a little wisdom, an additional tax might lead to the same result here.
It's only my interpretation, but I do not expect that most of the miners who walked to that meeting expected to hear that sort of thing, or really would go along with it seriously. And it's this that disturbs the government, La Trobe, and, the ruling elite, if you like to put it in Marxist terms. And you can't really be surprised that it did either. But it's not only that yarn. The rhetoric is of unity, the bundle of sticks will not break, unity, combination, it's resisting oppression, etc., etc. Now, this places it in context because the men at that meeting, and there's nobody there from that meeting yet who would have responded to the news of the gold rushes. They're already in the colonies.
Responded from Europe.
Yes. Yeah. They come from a situation in Britain where you have an extraordinary period of dissent about various things in the 1840s, we'll say, or the 1830s. The Act of Parliament in 1832 reformed Parliament only to the extent of enfranchising the middle classes and left the working classes disenfranchised. That caused a lot of discontent. You have, therefore, Chartism, the demand for one man, one vote, etc. You have the dissenting religions rising, like Methodism. You have the anti-Corn Law movement. You have machine breaking. I could go on and on. Owenite socialism. It's all going round and round and round. So our monster meeting is not occurring in a vacuum. There are echoes of that in those speeches.
Yes.
Now, that's very alarming. If you're in the faction that wants things to stay as they are, and you're hoping for a knighthood at the end of your governorship, you become alarmed. And I believe that what happened from reading La Trobe's dispatches back to Westminster, that he really panicked at that point. Before that time, he knew he had problems on his hands with the goldfields, but he came up to the goldfields himself. He rode probably with only one manservant. That's the way he usually travelled. He was here in late October, and even at that stage he wrote back in the kind of tone almost of a tourist, you know, how interesting it all was. So after the monster meeting, you see in his dispatches more than a note of panic. He immediately starts asking for military troops from Britain, and more urgently, of course, from New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land. He wants the military to come. He immediately starts looking backward to the old Australia as it was, a military regime.
So he's taking these threats
He took them seriously.
He took them seriously.
He's talking about sedition and overthrowing Her Majesty's government. He took them seriously. Now, you always have to understand that to get anything back to Westminster, it's 3 months.
Yes.
Then things have to happen, and then it's 3 months back. So it's at least 6 months to achieve anything. So military troops from Britain were going to be a long-term thing. So he wrote to Fitzroy in Sydney saying, "You must send me troops." Now, Fitzroy regarded him as a bit of a ditherer, you know, he always had. And he said, "Well, really, you know, we've had our own gold rushes and we seem to have survived. I'll give you 20 men." And La Trobe was talking like 200.
So Governor La Trobe hears talk of secession and other things, and he panics. But the diggers have already... They say a few other interesting things. Potts does admit when he speaks further on, after threatening this, you know, we could do what America did, there are few here who would advocate such separation. Now, it all depends in which tone he said it.
That's the trouble. You don't know whether they were laughing or what the crowd was doing. I mean, it must have been pretty hysterical and shambolic.
And he continues straight away, few who do not love the country of their adoption, few who do not feel themselves free, and none, I trust, who would be slaves. Now, this is a new spirit, isn't it, amongst the ordinary working people of the world?
It's new in the sense that it's been fermenting back in England already since the 1830s and 40s. It's transplanted to here. But look at the society you're transplanting it to. There's no aristocracy. There's no established church. There's only a very thin crust of gentry. Of course things are going to change. But we have this wonderful confrontation in the middle of nowhere over the gold licence issue with all these things resonating through it. It's just wonderful.
So the meeting concludes. Horse band plays another tune for everybody before they disperse.
And off they go to their tents and their evening meal.
The illustration we have of the monster meeting shows the diggers around the dray, the speakers on the dray, nearby the flag, the diggers' flag. And in a tree, up which there's a few people, there's a banner hanging that says the Argus. So the Argus are reporting on it. The Argus have got their banner out at the meeting, and Howard, the reporter, at the end of the meeting, when the diggers form the association, agrees to become treasurer. Is the idea of an impartial press just not relevant at this point of time? What's the situation with
The
the
idea
media?
was current that the press should be impartial. It just so happens that the Argus was not. The editor was a man called William Kerr. He had been the owner of the Argus, but he had lost so many lawsuits, libel suits, that he was now only the editor of the Argus and somebody else owned it. And one of his aims was to get rid of Governor La Trobe, but that was also part of his agenda to have democratic forms of government instituted. But he just wrote the most splenetic editorials against La Trobe's policies on a wide range of issues, and the goldfields and the licence issue were just simply a godsend. And he kept after La Trobe the whole time.
Was this personal?
I don't know why it would have been personal, although he made a lot of personal comments about La Trobe strutting around in his uniform with feathers in his hat. I mean, you think the press is rough these days, you should read some of these editorials. They're really something against La Trobe. Now, this La Trobe versus William Kerr was one of the great sort of delights of Melbourne society. There was nothing La Trobe could do about it in public because of the dignity of his office, but he was busy behind the scenes writing back to Westminster to say that this man was guilty of sedition and was pushing through his newspaper to overthrow Her Majesty's government, which was wrong. They weren't. What they were pushing was what happened with the new constitution in 1854. La Trobe detested them, detested William Kerr, and no, it wasn't impartial. The whole administration of the goldfields was an absolute godsend, and Commissioner Wright, later Commissioner Bull, Commissioner Powlett could do no right in the eyes of the Argus.
Was there another newspaper in town?
Yes, there was the Melbourne Morning Herald, which had a reporter up here quite early on, and the reporter himself was quite sympathetic about the licence cause, but the editorial took after the monster meeting, the leaders of the monster meeting in a big way, called them, implied that they were convicts and this, that and the other. Yes. So it was very hard to sell a copy of the Melbourne Morning Herald on the diggings thereafter. But you can make a distinction between the reporter, Howard, and the editorials, because I, as a historian, use Howard's virtually daily reports on a wide range of issues other than politics or the licence. It's just wonderful stuff. Yes. You know.
And it's also amazing that his report on the monster meeting, the speeches, I've got 12 pages of it here.
Where did he go? Back to his tent to scribble it out, or was he scribbling there and then? It was
maybe
a
a bit of both.
Major effort, wasn't it?
Yeah. So the first meeting's on the 8th of December, the second meeting's on the 15th, the monster meeting. On the 17th, the diggers find out that La Trobe has backed off on doubling the licence, but the date on the backing off is the 13th.
That's right.
So 2 days before the monster
Yes,
meeting.
he changed his mind before the monster meeting.
So he changed his mind after the first meeting on the 8th.
Yes. So probably it wasn't the meeting on the 15th that did the trick, it was the campaign leading up to it that caused him to change his mind.
So the 4,000 strong meeting
Probably.
caused him to...
We don't know for certain, but he changed his mind.
Or is there any chance that he judiciously backdated?
There is a chance. It was done. It had been done, yes. That would be William Lonsdale, the colonial secretary, backdating it. It's a possibility, but we can't. We shouldn't even be really saying it, Jan, because we can't prove it.
Okay.
It had been done, backdating notices.
Well, if this was late line, you might want to question him on that line to see how, and look at the whites of his eyes as he answered. So, but you'd have to say the monster meetings got all of the we know about it so much because of the sheer size of 15,000 people. So whatever it is, between the two meetings, he backed off.
Yes, the miners won.
The miners won. But in the backing off, he said, okay, we'll leave it at 30 shillings. But it's then, and this is where you reprimanded me before, it's then that he says, okay then, all of the shopkeepers and all of everybody else, not digging but working on the goldfields, is going to have to pay. And it's then that he brings in the police on half a cut of all of the fines they generate, and then he brings in the paid informers. So he seems to be, on the one hand, being sensible, and on the other hand, being quite unsensible by bringing in these new regulations that are, in some ways, worse.
This is the Mining Act of January 1852 you're referring to.
Sorry, I can't remember the exact name.
Yes. The truth of the matter was that the regulations passed in the middle of 1851 were a bit wobbly, and they weren't quite sure whether they could really prosecute the miners or not. This is a bit technical, Jan.
Get technical.
The Court of Petty Sessions was not set up here until... Oh, no, I don't have my notes. In order to prosecute anybody, you have to have a court. And a notice appeared in the Victorian Government Gazette. My favourite reading, that Victorian Government Gazette, what they managed to finagle in there. I think it was November. They realised that if they were actually going to prosecute anyone for non-payment of the licence, there had to be a duly constituted court. So all it said was that Forest Creek would be the place for the holding of petty sessions, and the second thing they had to do was make the gold commissioners magistrates, because under British law you had to have a court and 2 magistrates to prosecute anyone successfully. So the records for the Court of Petty Sessions that we actually have access to only start in January 52, so I don't even know whether anyone was prosecuted before that. Okay. So I think that act was passed to firm up the regulations and to say, well, yes, you are going to be prosecuted if you don't pay, and by the way, everyone on the goldfields has to pay. This was a shot at the what they used to call the idlers and vagabonds and criminals who flocked to the place because they were going to be able to slit people's tents open and steal the gold and this kind of thing, you know. So, okay, we'll get at them by making them pay a licence as well, and storekeepers will have to buy a licence too. In some ways, that was not a stupid or silly thing to do. They actually tried to revamp the Vagrancy Act in the December 1851 to catch people on the goldfields who were not actually mining for gold. But the Legislative Council, almost its first act, it threw that out, didn't pass it. There is a Vagrancy Act to this day, but so that the Mining Act of 1852 really tidied up a bit. Mm. But it also brought in that noxious clause that the informer, that is the policeman, would get half the fines, which immediately skewed the efforts of the police, you see. They weren't interested in chasing ordinary common or garden criminals when they wouldn't get half the fine for so doing.
And did that set in train the bad relationship between diggers and police that led all the way through to Eureka?
Yes, that set it in train. The great enthusiasm of the police and the fact that a lot of them were pretty rough characters, some of them had certainly been supervising convicts, they treated the men badly. They treated them in a bully boy fashion, and their technique was to come out on a raid and go right round the goldfields collecting men who didn't have a licence, handcuff them, and in an ever-increasing crocodile, take them round and then back to the petty sessions. Well, here it was by the time they got it going. So it was humiliating. Sometimes you didn't have your licence for a good reason. Sometimes you'd left it in your tent and that wasn't accepted as an excuse, etc., etc., etc. It was just it wasn't British, as they used to say, you know.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be treating men that way. Now, of course, the gold commissioners would say, well, you knew very well you had to have a licence when you came. What are you complaining about? If you take it out, it won't happen. You've got 30 shillings for a bottle of grog. Why can't you buy a licence? That was another charge against them.
Yes.
And that was right. They did know when they came onto the fields that they had to pay the licence. Sometimes it was just penury. They didn't find any gold and they didn't have the money.
Yes.
We know that it was the men who found gold in any month who bought it, obviously. But they had another little trick. They would buy one licence per party.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a reason for that, because under the same Mining Act, the commissioners were given the right to arbitrate disputes over claims, but you couldn't have a right to arbitration unless you had a licence. So, right, we're a party of 6, we'll take out one licence.
So why did Latrobe bring in this system where the police got half of the fines they collected? What was the purpose?
The motive was to make them, to get them to collect the revenue, because they needed the revenue. They also got half the fine for prosecuting the sly groggers. So another little warfare broke out between the police and the sly groggers.
There's one thing I've omitted to bring up about the monster meeting. After the monster meeting, the diggers formed a committee and sent a delegation to Melbourne.
Yes.
What happened?
It's very hard to get to the bottom of that. They were sent to La Trobe. They didn't reach La Trobe, I'm pretty sure of that. They said in a published report in the Argus that they had a meeting with the Colonial Secretary, Lonsdale. Now, you understand that the Colonial Secretary is La Trobe's last line of defence. You have to write to the Colonial Secretary, not the governor.
Yes.
Yes. So they only got that far, and I don't think they got any satisfaction at all. But they held a large meeting on Flagstaff Hill, which was quite well attended, because there were always a lot of miners having rest and recreation in Melbourne.
Flagstaff Hill being near the present-day Victoria Market.
That's right, yes. They held a very successful meeting there, which was well attended, and they formed the Victorian Gold Mining Association. They formed an association. They reported back to the miners in Mount Alexander, and an unknown number of miners joined that association. The secretary, Dr. Valentine Webb Richmond, a medical doctor, plus a man of great knowledge about geology and gold mining from his letters to the Argus, was the secretary, and he drew up, presumably in consultation with the rest of the committee, a document which suggested ways in which the licence system could be done better, not done away with. And I found a copy of it in the Colonial Secretary's correspondence, and it was minuted with this. It's absolute rubbish, and what would you expect from that seditious character sort of thing, and that was as far as it ever got. But they did take up one case of a miner who was, he said, wrongfully busted for sly grogging. And his long complaint is in the files. He took it to the Mining Association, and Webb Richmond tried to take it to La Trobe. But once again, it went on the circuit. The policeman who was the culprit was given the document to comment on and said it was absolute falsehood. And of course, I didn't burn down his tent and blah, blah, blah.
Okay, so that's like getting the police to investigate the police.
Exactly. Why are we surprised?
For us today, looking back at the monster meeting, what do we inherit? What's its legacy, and how should we place it in the overarching story, which we're not going to go into today? But from here, the protests happen in Bendigo with the Red Ribbon agitation, and then later at Eureka, 3 years after the monster meeting, there's the Eureka Stockade, and 35-ish or so miners lose their lives, plus about 6 troopers. The monster meeting's at the beginning of this. I know this is 2 questions in one, but how should we understand the significance of the monster meeting in the history of the day, and how should we think, what can we take out of it?
It's a tradition of not allowing yourself to be trampled on by people with power. It's standing up for your rights, getting together and standing up for your rights. And there's huge traditions of this in Australia on all sorts of issues, of which we can be very proud. Moratorium against Vietnam, etc., etc. It seems to me that it's very much in that tradition. What they did, it was somehow almost instinctive in them. And what they took away from it was that in unity there was strength. They called it, I don't know that they invented it, but passive resistance was the tool they fashioned on that occasion. And the men at Red Ribbon knew that passive resistance could work. It wasn't the same as Eureka. It wasn't the same at Eureka. And behind the scenes, the authorities knew that if the men refused to pay the licence, they could not enforce it. They say that behind the scenes.
In their letters.
In their letters. The other thing that they understand, at least after Red Ribbon, is that if the miners defy them in the sense of physical defiance, the mines were like a series of rabbit warrens. And if the miners disappeared into those in a guerrilla-type action, the authorities were powerless. Now, the miners never ever thought of doing that, but the authorities had perceived that they might. And after Red Ribbon, both Commissioner Wright and La Trobe were very keen to get rid of the licence because they knew they couldn't cope if either of those things happened. But what do we take from it personally? Well, we take some kind of Australian, Australian idea that you band together for your rights. You know, I think we're losing it, yeah. I think we're losing it. But that's what I take from it, and that's the way I was brought up, in the household that I was brought up in. It was anyway in the trades union movement, most obviously, but it's in the big public campaigns that environmental movement now and so on. I think it's connected. I think if there was a lesson that was learned, it was that, and it was learned very early, there, on that day.
Well, Marjorie, Theobald, thanks very much. That was really great to listen to. Thank you.
And thank you.